Welcome back to another episode of the podcast.
Hi.
Good day.
I was really trying to figure where you're going to go with that one. Okay.
So we are continuing with the parables that we started last time, or two episodes ago, and we got 3 more for this series. So strap in, stay tuned, get ready.
Oh, that was okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, this episode's parable is brought to you by the
Bible.
by the letter B for Bible. No, it's, or it could be P for parable.
Okay.
We're talking about the rich fool. And the entire story is in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 21. I'm not going to read through the whole story. I think that may take us just too much time. I am going to reference it from the NLT. So if you're following along or reading the story, just know I'm going to reference an NLT. Basically, the parable starts in verse 16, but in verse 13 to 15, it sets up the reason why Jesus goes into this parable, like the real life scenario that happens, which is basically someone in the crowd yells at Jesus he says, "Please tell my brothers to divide our father's estate with me." Jesus' response to that is, "Friend, who made me judge over you to decide such things?" Right? Then he continues and says, "Beware and guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." Just from that part alone, any thoughts there on that part before we get into the actual parable?
Yeah, I think it's something that I've had to remind myself that life is not measured based off of what you own, especially like in today's culture. I'm pretty sure it's prevalent in every generation, but everyone's always like, "Oh, I have this and I have this." But like, I feel like it's even worse like with TikTok culture where everyone's like buying everything and everyone has the same things.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, like when we go into the actual parable, I drew this conclusion more so from the parable, but I think it applies to this part of the story as well. It's amazing to me to see how even at the time, like biblical times, people were just still so obsessed with their wealth and their things. I mean, the parable is about things and what happens with that, but yeah, I just thought that was really interesting just to see this, like, you know, we always talk about the Bible sort of, it's God's eternal word. And though what's recorded in the Bible, or at least, specifically, you know, what happens with the life of Jesus happened 2,000 years ago, yet it so easily applies to our lives today, right? You know, sometimes we even talk about some of the parables themselves might be hard to understand because he really spoke to the people in that time, right? Yeah. Like, you know, a lot of it is agricultural related, right? Like I think 2, or at least one of the ones that we talked about was agriculture, right? But this one is the one we're going to talk about is so easy for us to understand. And that parable basically is Jesus' response to the crowd. He and basically the story is a rich man has a very fertile farm, and he's producing so many good crops that he actually runs out of room to store them in his barn. So he decides that he will tear down the barns that he has and build larger ones. Then he'll have room to store everything that he's producing. And he says to himself that he has stored away enough. I don't know why that was so hard to say. Stored away enough for years to come, and now he can take things easy and just eat and drink and be merry. God says to him, "You fool, you will die this very night. and then who will get everything you worked for? And Jesus ends this kind of portion of the scripture by saying in verse 21, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. Okay. I know you've read the parable in more detail.
Yep.
First thoughts before I kind of go through the things I took away from it.
Thoughts? I think it's like we said, it's a very relevant story to still like look at for today. I think it's also, it kind of like puts you in check a little bit because you're working so hard to acquire these things and like have stuff or build wealth. But at the end of the day, like, first of all, what are you doing with it, right? Because it's just going to sit in your house when you're dead. Or someone's going to come in and sort through and decide that whatever you have is not worth anything to them and throw it away. And then also, like, there is more to life than just acquiring things and having tangible items, right? I think that relationship with God is one of the most valuable things, is the most valuable thing that you can have in life, right? Because it brings you so much more in terms of just like satisfaction in life, of just like having that close relationship with God, I think is more valuable than having anything. It's never going to go out of style. It's free sometimes in terms of money. It might cost you some other things, but you probably didn't need them to begin with. And like, it's just, the value of life that you have is more quantifiable than anything that you could actually own.
Yeah, it's going back to the thing, just the thought of you accumulate all of these things, then when you die, what do you do with it, right? Like, what happens to it? I saw a clip of someone talking about, I guess his parents or his father passed away recently, and he and his wife were talking. I think, it's like a podcast or whatever, and she's asked him, like, what did you learn from, he's a father himself. What did he learn about just the entire funeral process, right? And he goes, when everything was said and done, he had to go to his parents' house and sort through all of his dad's stuff. And he goes, like, there was all this stuff, and he said the only thing that I think it was him and his sister, the only things they took were like some pajamas, because it had like real sentimental value to them. Mm-hmm. And I think like their dad used to wear just one very specific cologne, and I think they both took like a bottle of it or something, and that was it, right? Like everything else his father had, he's like, he just went to Goodwill or whatever. And looking at this story of a guy who his business is doing so well that he can store up basically enough profit for years to come, right? Which I'm still trying to figure out how do they store up crops in that time for years to come? I feel like you were going to ask the same thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Jesus was exaggerating in the parable.
Well, I mean, if you look at like Egypt, right, when they had the famine, they were storing up enough grain that they were
that's
able
true.
to,
Yes. Okay. So then he wasn't exaggerating, but it is a very important question. I think that is not really the point of the parable per se, but the idea of like just what are you leaving behind, and we can circle back to that. But when looking at the actual story, right? I don't remember when we decided on this. I don't think I was in that meeting when we actually decided on the parables we were doing for this study. So I'm looking at the rich fool, and I thought it was the rich young ruler. Then I realized that's not a parable. That was like an actual person. So when I read this, I was like, oh, we don't really talk about this parable too much. And my, of course, first thing is, well, why is he a fool? Right? Because business-wise, I think he did nothing wrong. right? Anyone that's running a business, if you have like, if you're in a business in which you have an inventory and you have to store things, if you don't have place to store all the stuff, you have to find place to store it, right? Like one of the people I work with, they're always talking about like, we wish we could just buy the building and remodel it so that we could store things better, right? Because it's like you have to hold more merchandise on hand, but you have no place to put it properly, right? And that's always the issue. So when I look at this story, I'm like, he's not a fool when it comes to business, right? And I think that's an important thing, right? Like, as a businessman, he was clearly blessed in what he was doing, right? And even in, I think it's verse 19, when he says he's stored enough for years to come and he's going to eat, drink, and be merry, to me, that just sounds like retirement.
Yeah.
Right? Like realistically, that sounds like retirement, right? He's just going to live off the work he's done before, and it's going to keep just generating profit for him, and he doesn't have to work anymore, right? That in and of itself doesn't seem like a bad thing. And I think for most of us, we all hope we reach that point if we're in, you live long enough that you can sit back and relax and enjoy, I guess, the fruits of your labor. Go ahead.
I think what it comes down to is his intent for doing it, because in storing up and saving up, yeah, he's able to live off of it and whatever, but he could also do a lot more good with it in the current moment while still acquiring more, right? So like, I don't know, like giving it to like the people in the neighborhood or whatever, like selling it or just spreading the wealth. And I think that's kind of part of what the issue is.
And it's funny because I was like really thinking about that. And it's like, how much can you give away at the same time? Mm-hmm. Right? Because, and maybe this is just a horrible line of question of thought, but it's like, it's great to give, but how much can he give too? Right? Obviously, I guess he can give a lot because he has enough stored for years to come, but
I don't think he was in the mindset of giving it all.
Right. But at the same time, if he gives and no one is buying it, then how does he now live? Right? Which was kind of which is one of the things I thought of when reading it. Just like, oh, he can give it away, but then if he gives it all away and he's not making anything, how does he live? But yeah, to your point, his mindset was never sharing it. His mindset was, I'm just going to hoard it to make more money.
I think sometimes also, when you have a solid relationship with God, right? Sometimes to other people it seems like you're giving out of nothing, but then you end up working like, because you're being obedient to God and because you're giving where you don't think you have enough to give, you kind of become blessed and become prosperous in other ways that people wouldn't have imagined. So I think going back to this parable, it's like, yeah, you have all this stuff, but you're poor in spirit, right? Mm-hmm. You're poor in those things that could prosper you in ways that you couldn't even have foreseen in terms of having this barn full of wheat or whatever.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to the last verse of the parable, right? Or actually, well, so what Jesus says to conclude the parable, right? A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. Does that mean we shouldn't look to acquire wealth here on earth?
I don't think acquiring wealth should be the priority. But I do think it is important to have some type of monetary goal just to be able to survive. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've noticed, especially since COVID or since like TikTok became popular, right? There has been sort of this resurgence of going after pastors who do have money and things like that, right? Like there are accounts who online that like just post, hey, this pastor
He's wearing
wore
like $1,000 shoes.
yeah, and stuff like that. There's one for shoes, and then I think there's one for watches also. You know, and it's interesting because like some of the pastors are like good sports about it, and then other ones are like kind of like take this down, like, you know, blah blah blah. And again, I look at this scripture where Jesus goes, "A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." And I love how he puts sort of like criteria for having earthly wealth, right? To have earthly wealth, but not a rich relationship with God, you're a fool. Mm-hmm. Which to me means you can have earthly wealth, which I think a lot of people somewhat struggle with as believers. But the point, as you said, that shouldn't be the priority. Mm. The priority should be our relationship with God, right? And from that relationship with God, everything else should come out of that.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have a really rich relationship with God and God is blessing you in the workplace, right? And because of that, you get a lot of promotions or something at work. You start your own business and it does really well. All of these things happen in which you are able to accumulate wealth, right? Because you have a rich relationship with God, it's not a bad thing, right?
I think also just because a pastor can be well paid doesn't mean that his church is lacking in certain ways, or that the money that is being paid towards him can be going do you know what I mean?
I think so.
So just because a pastor is acquiring wealth or has nice things, it doesn't mean that that money is being taken out of certain ministries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So a lot of these pastors that do have nice things are great pastors and great speakers. And so you see their blessings in the size of their churches or the prosperous lives of their members and stuff like that. And so in turn, it's like the reward for their work, right? Mm-hmm. For being faithful and for being obedient. So some of them can afford to have these multiple $1,000 watches or cars or fancy shoes. Mm-hmm.
It's like one of the things I always see, it's the implication, I think, when you see people critique pastors or just Christian leaders who have wealth, is they're using church money to pay for this, mm-hmm. right? And I think people don't sometimes understand that in most of those cases, those pastors receive a salary, right? And to me, and this is my opinion, if once they receive a salary, it's no longer the church's money. It is their money. Now, as a believer, they should be good stewards of that money, right? And I would hope that if they are buying expensive things, that they aren't doing that at the expense of, grocery, because there are people who will do things and buy expensive things and live above their means. And I would hope that they aren't doing that, and that as good stewards of God's money, we're only seeing some items that we are assuming they bought. Right? And I know people say people gift things, and that's fine. I don't know how much of that is gifted or not, but I also know a lot of these pastors also write books, right? Which supplements their income, right?
Or they'll do speaking engagements.
They do speaking engagements. And honestly, for some of them, you just don't know. Maybe they just have good stock investments, because a lot of these and I'm not trying to make an excuse for bad stewards. I'm sure there are some of those guys who are bad stewards.
There's always going to
right?
be.
But
Yeah.
I think what we have to be able to is go less, okay, hey, how are you? Why is this guy spending X, blah, blah, blah? They go, well, what am I doing with my money?
That's what I was about to say. Like, stop watching their pockets and watch your own.
Right? And what's really funny to me is a lot of times the people criticizing aren't the ones who are giving to that church. Like, most times if someone has a problem with the pastor or something, they're probably not going to stay in that church and continue to support that church. They'll go to another church and support that one, which I have no problem with. If you feel more comfortable at another church, you go there, you support that ministry, perfectly fine. But when you go online and you see those people, that wouldn't happen in my church. Okay, cool. That's why you're at that church. Like, it's really funny. Obviously, I have family who are pastors and stuff. And someone was like, oh, well, why don't you go to like that church instead of like the one? I was like, that church isn't for me. It's not to knock my own family. It's just, that's not the church for me. Right? So I think a lot of us sometimes we get caught up in earthly wealth, right? I think we sometimes get caught up in how do we acquire it? And I think we get caught up in how did that guy acquire it, right? When Jesus is saying the priority is your relationship with God, right? Where is your relationship with God? And I think too many of us, our relationship with God takes a back seat to something else, right? In the case of this parable, it was earthly possessions. For some of us, it could be our education. For some of us, it could be romantic relationships. It could be our marriage, our kids, or whatever, right? But I think for a lot of people, there is something else that a relationship with God takes second to. And I think Jesus is saying, and the things that our relationship with God takes second to aren't bad things, right? That's what I thought was so interesting about the parable, right? That's why I talked about he was a good businessman, right? His business wasn't bad, right? It doesn't say that he made his money illegally or anything like that, right? There is nothing here in the story to indicate that this was a man of bad reputation or anything like that, right? Jesus's point here is rather, what do you have that's first in your life? Is it God or is it something else, right? And I think for a lot of us, we do need to sometimes take a step back and reevaluate our lives and go, well, it's easy to say God is first in our life, but do my actions prove that? Right? Because I'm sure this guy could have said, oh no, God is first. I go to temple every week or whatever. I observe Sabbath and whatever, I do all these things. Yet his actions were, the business was priority.
I think even going to that, a lot of people would say like, yeah, God is first in my life. I do all these things in the church, right? But at the end of the day, like when you step out of the church, do people still know that God is first in your life? Like without having to ask you in certain ways? Or like just based off of the way you act, the way you like carry yourself, is it visible to them when you're not in your church like mindset? And that's and if you do have, or you are building that relationship with God, that will be more apparent in a lot of things that you do. Because like I've hung out with certain friends and stuff, and they haven't been like not religious, not Christian or whatever, and so, but they would like know not to talk about certain things around me, just like off bat, without me saying like, yeah, I'm a Christian, I go to church and I do all these things, but just the way that I speak or the way that we've like spoken about certain things, they know not to bridge certain gaps with me.
Right.
And so I think that comes down to not just having the relationship with God, but also striving to be more like Christ in the example that he has set for us. Because it'll flow out in different parts of your life.
100%. And yeah, I think that's one of the things that we have to kind of, I think sometimes we need to be reminded of it, right? Because, and again, right, it is easy to get caught up and making life happen becomes priority over a relationship with God, right? And I think, a lot of times I think when we regulate our relationship with God to only coming to church, and though it's an important part of our relationship, if when that becomes sort of the standard for our relationship with God, it is easy for us to misprioritize our life. Because, like, obviously, the two of us, having grown up in church, we have spent a lot of time in church outside of a Sunday service, right? For the most part, we still do.
Yeah.
Right? And
we're here right now.
Right? And I think, especially when I was like younger, I kind of associated my physical presence in church as a gauge of my spirituality.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
Like, I am super spiritual because I'm here for Sunday morning service, Sunday night service, youth group, prayer service. I come in during the week to set up stuff. I'm here for rehearsals. I'm here for drama team. I'm here for this. I'm here for that. So I am super spiritual, yet to some degree, just doing things in church became a bigger priority than a relationship with God.
Yeah.
Right? And again, right, doing stuff in church isn't bad. Volunteering and being a part of ministry is encouraged. But when that takes priority over your relationship with God, you have it backwards. And you have to fix that.
Yeah, I remember like a while ago I had a conversation with my mom, and she was like, she's kind of like just checking on me, and she's like, hey, like, let's just make sure that you're not doing so much in church that you are not also like making sure that you're spending as much time with God. Right? Because you're doing all these things in church, right? And your children church, your drama team, your youth group, whatever. But like, how's your actual walk with God going right now? Like, are you spending as much time with him as you are spending like in church? And then even when you are in church, are you so busy doing these things that you're not actually like, like taking in what is happening in church? And so that was like, when like after we had that conversation, I was like, yeah, I'm straight, right? I'm doing all the things. But like it helped to put things in perspective for me, because like, yeah, I'm spending time outside of church preparing these lessons and like reading these scripts and whatever it is. But like, am I bringing God into them at the same time?
Yeah, I had a conversation with a pastor friend, because one of the things that, so realistically, I would say probably before 2020, but definitely since things reopened, I don't know that I've actually sat in a service without me like working in that service in that sense, right? I don't think I really have, whether it's a prayer service, maybe a handful of youth services, but then at that point, youth service wasn't really geared towards me in that sense, right? So, and the reason I say that is because that's always been sort of a struggle in our church and many other churches of there are certain ministries where when the team is small, you have people always just serving to make sure it happens, right? Like realistically, a lot of the people probably on our band probably serve every week. I can think of like a handful of people. Some rotate in and out, maybe every other Sunday. Some people are on every Sunday, right? That's just because of limitations of just the people we have, and sometimes also just for continuity and flow of certain things. You need to have the same person on every week. But when I was talking with that pastor, he goes, well, what are you as a leader doing to make sure that the people you're leading on your team are still being fed then spiritually if they have to be on every week? And I was like, oh, that's a good point. What am I doing? Right. And that kind of challenged me to go, okay, I need to change my approach to the way I lead certain teams. So again, it's what is the priority, right? Is it a rich, and I like that Jesus didn't just say a relationship with God, but it was, he qualified it with a rich relationship with God, right? Because realistically, anyone can have a relationship with God, right? Whether that's a relationship of you have animosity towards him or whatever the case may be, you have a relationship with him, right? But it's to have a rich, which to me means a fulfilling relationship with God, right? That requires work. That requires work that goes beyond coming to church on Sunday, that goes beyond listening to a podcast, that goes beyond coming to church on a Sunday and then listening to other pastors on their YouTube pages or whatever the case may be, right? There has to be a personal relationship with God, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it's interesting because again, like the people you see on Sunday, right, like in church, right, you can have a good relationship with them, right? But when you actually begin to have a close, intimate relationship with them is when you're not just seeing them within the four walls of your church, right? It's when you guys actually begin to have conversations and hang out outside of the church, right? That you begin to develop a relationship. And I think for some reason, we don't equate that to how we treat God. And a lot of times we lose out on our relationship with God because we just don't spend enough time with him.
I think a lot of times we qualify, like we limit our relationship with God to whatever is in church. And I think that comes with just being like a baby Christian. But as you grow and as you become more mature, and not just like in the word, you kind of learn to expand that relationship, I think. Because you're not just maturing in the word, you're also maturing in, like, you should be maturing in relationships within the church, right? Building a network of people around you that can lead and guide you as well. People that are more adept and more spiritually mature to kind of grow from and with.
I agree. And the last scripture I want to read, I'm assuming this is also from Luke 12, because I didn't write it down, but it's a continuing verse. If you have time, I encourage you to read all of Luke 12, or at least the scriptures we talked about were verses 13. And I'm going to jump into verse 34, but read the entire piece. It's all about this same thing about wealth, right? Because in verses 22 to 29, right, Jesus just talks about things in general, right? Like not even having like abundance the way the guy did in the parable, but he just talks about don't worry about your everyday life, right? Like don't worry if you have enough food to eat or enough clothes to wear, because life is more than food and your body is more than clothing, right? And please don't misinterpret this scripture to mean like you shouldn't eat or wear clothes. Please eat and wear clothes.
Wear enough clothes.
Yeah. But when you jump down to verse 31, he says, "Seek the kingdom of God above all else, and he, meaning God, will give you everything you need. So don't be afraid, little flock, for it gives your Father great happiness to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasure for you in heaven, and the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe, no thief can steal it, and no moth can destroy it." And verse 34, "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be." Right? And I think just to wrap things up, I think that last verse 34, "Wherever your treasure is, there your desires of your heart will also be," kind of, I think, also sums up what Jesus was talking about with the rich fool, right? Is the desire of your heart God, or is it something else? Because if it's God, that's what is going to be the priority. That's what's going to emanate out of your life, God.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else.
No.
Okay, that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. Drop a comment or two. Yeah.
Cool. Share.
Bye.